Loud? That's a good sign. We all good? Perfect. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the last session of the day, Club Constitutions, which is the coolest session of the day, and it's going to be the most fun. The big rule today is I'm not a professor, and I don't want to try to be. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, anything like that, just feel free to raise your hand. And I want to try to make this a back and forth instead of just me talking for the next hour, because that doesn't sound very fun. So to start, it almost worked. So to start, a little bit about me. For those of you who I haven't met yet, my name is Max. I'm the president of the Mock Trial Club here at Ottawa. This summer, I was just going over some things, and I realized I've written a weird amount of constitutions. I'm a little bit of a nerd for it, which I guess is why I'm in poli-sci. So I have a little bit of street cred when it comes to writing constitutions, and this is something that I'm very passionate about because this is something that is very important whenever you're trying to start a club or amend a constitution for a current club. And so the first thing we have today is just what is a club constitution? So I just want to throw this onto the floor now. What do you guys think of when you hear the word constitution, or specifically when it applies to clubs here? Yes, Katie.
Of rules that kind of govern the club government and
Is there anything in the chat? Perfect. Yeah, which is, Katie basically has it right. The Constitution, go here. Why do you need a Constitution? Is because a Constitution is a set of rules for how your club runs, and it's just the word I use is foundation. It is the thing that kind of lays out the rules, how your club runs, what you do, and it allows you to give the services that you give to your members. Says how your club is run day to day, and it gives a nice framework for how your members interact with the club, how your executives are chosen, what your executives do, and all that fun stuff. It is one of the requirements when you first register. So most people here, if they first register to club, Constitution is one of the big things they need. And it's a generally really useful tool that you can use to help, that you can then use to help run your club and deliver services to your members. And one of the big things, if there's nothing else you take away from the presentation today, it's this, which is that there's no perfect way to write a constitution, and that nothing I say today is gospel. It's really useful because you guys are here basically to talk about how to write a constitution. But in general, when you're writing a constitution, there is no one perfect way to do it. It depends a lot on what your club does and who's running your club. So the other big takeaway is that second bullet point there, which is that amendment is not a dirty word. And that's something, because when we think about constitutions, we think of something that's unchanging and that, rarely changes. We think of US Constitution that hasn't been amended since the 90s. When we're talking about club constitutions and things for running organizations, a personal thing of mine is that amendment should not be a dirty word, because your constitution should be a thing to serve your club, not the other way around, which is something that some clubs fall into. They see this kind of big, long, almost legal document, and they try to change their own club processes to try to fit. And we think that if you make too much red tape for yourself, then that affects your ability to deliver services to your members. So just a show of hands, how many people here came to Ottawa after about 2018? Exactly. And how many people here, the clubs that you're part of, how many of those clubs were founded before 2018? Exactly. Because there's a good chance that the Constitution that y'all have currently was all the students that wrote it are currently graduated. And so we think that constitutions should update with the times. Things happen, circumstances change, your club changes, the people who are running it change. And so we think that by updating your constitution and keeping it up to date is something that'll be really useful to make sure it continues to help serve your club. And also the last bullet point there is remember the club's code. The club's code is basically the constitution for constitution. It is the rule book that the clubs committee and the student union requires all clubs to follow if they want funding and if they want to be recognized. And it has some rules and guidelines in it to make sure that all clubs kind of follow a general structure and to make sure that we aren't none of our clubs are being corrupt or do anything bad or inequitable. So next section here is what should a constitution look like? So if we are writing a constitution from scratch, what should we do? And for those of you in established clubs, if you can take away from this presentation is just some general things. If you're wanting to amend your constitution or make some changes, that's something you should be taking away from this. So first section here we have on basic structure, which is the whole reason why I ended up volunteering to do this presentation, because I was talking with some of my friends last year and they were saying, oh yeah, I've always wanted to start a club, but writing a constitution is scary. I don't know how to do it. And so there's just some like really basic things that when I've been reading over constitutions for this presentation, that pretty much all clubs follow, which is that, well, as it says up there, a constitution consists of articles. Each article will follow kind of one of the basic areas of the club. So events or definitions or elections or something like that. And each article will have a bunch of different clauses or sections within it. Each of those sections covers like one specific idea. And the rule of thumb for that is that each clause should exist independently of one another. And so should be 1 to 2 sentences and should be something that you're able to cite. So you look here examples. You can see here ways of like a good and bad way to write a couple of sections. So you should be writing things in the third person, abstractly, and formally. So don't use any proper names. Don't use like long rambling run-on sentences, and make sure it's something you're able to cite. So in this case, if I wanted to talk about the way that you remove the president of the club, in this case me, I can say according to 1.2.1, something like that. Was there a question?
Yeah, so I was just going to ask, so one would be the article.
Yes, there's no like, what's the word? There's no one way to structure articles and sections. The way that I do when I write constitutions is that, this will be article 1. And so you need 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, et cetera, et cetera. You can number all of your sections sequentially. So you could have like, section 136, or you can number it by articles, as long as it's something that generally makes sense and something they're able to cite. There's no one right way to do it. You just want to make sure that you're able to like, cite one section and everyone knows what you're talking about. Any more questions about that before we go on? Perfect. So next thing here, we're going to go pretty much sequentially. As we're writing this hypothetical constitution, what we would be talking about. So the first section here is on the preamble. And what this does is this lays out kind of the fundamental principles of why your club exists. This is the one thing that that is most likely to never change. And so you should be writing kind of in as broad terms as possible. So if you're a club that's like philanthropic club, you want to be talking about like the reasons for philanthropy in general, and stuff like that. Throughout the presentation, I'm going to be using some examples from clubs that I like and that do things well. This is an example from Model UN. And so you see here the language they use is kind of like very broad. They talking about international affairs and the benefits of that. And so the preamble is basically, if someone reads it, it is, why does your club exist? Why is it necessary? We'll get into that in a little bit in this, as well when we get to objectives and mandates. Sure.
Does it just be that format where?
That whereas, therefore, like that's the way that like laws are written and stuff like that. That's how I'd suggest to do it. But there's no, again, as I said before, the first slide, there's no like one way to do anything. But that's like the way that's most common, and that's the way I suggest. From the chat, perfect. So next thing is on name and definitions, and this is something I get a whole lot of questions about, which is how, like, why do I need to define things? What should I define? Stuff like that. Because if you look at things like laws and stuff like that, you'll have like pages and pages of definitions and legalese, and that can turn a lot of people off. So the rule of thumb, your first article for most constitutions, and the CBO, when they suggest how to write a constitution, they say this too. Your first article after your preamble should be, the name and definitions. So first off, what's the name of your club? The official thing, if you have acronyms, any like something that you can point to and say, this is what our club is called. And after that, the rule of thumb I use is to define any terms that are both really important and are different from what you think the standard definition is. Because it's basically something that if you read a word in the Constitution, if you're interpreting that word different than a normal person off the street would, putting it in the Constitution is nice when someone's needing to interpret it. So in this case, plug in my own club for a little bit. This is UMSU's official definition of a semester, which is a little bit different than what the school does because we don't define summers as a semester. And it's something that might end up being useful for other clubs because it's useful when it comes to like elections and stuff like that. That's the general gist behind it.
Sorry, what does UMSU stand for?
Good question, Katie. UMSU stands for the Undergraduate Mock Trial and Moot Court Society at the University of Ottawa, which is the club that I'm a co-president with, and certain Catherine Moore is also a co-president for.
Really good name.
So, any questions on that or anything on definitions? Perfect. So next next section here is objective and mandate. So we're talking a little bit about preamble, where you talk about kind of the broad strokes for why your club exists. This is where you can go into a little bit more specifics. So you talk about what your club does specifically, what do its members do, why does your club exist? And also something I suggest here is this is a good place to put in a commitment to equity. As it says to remember the club's code, there are rules that the student union requires for clubs to make sure that we don't have any white supremacist clubs on campus or anything like that. So to make sure that your club doesn't promote discrimination or won't have a substantially negative impact on a significant number of University of Ottawa students. I don't know if that language is the same in the new clubs code, but in general, putting a commitment to equity here, no matter what your club does, is generally a useful thing to do because when you're writing constitution, you have to understand it's not just for your current crop of execs, it's for your execs 10 or 20 years down the road, ideally. And so an example here comes from the UONDP. They actually have a really long objective and equity statement. All the political clubs tend to have pretty decent constitutions. So just if you're looking for some examples, looking for all of them, that might be a useful thing. You just see here having a commitment to equity and just explaining in broad terms what your club does. That's what the point of this is. Have any questions on that? Perfect. Next section, and this is one of the big ones, is on members, because all clubs exist to deliver services to their members, whether you're a philanthropic club and you're trying to raise money for charity, whether you're more of a competitive club and you're trying to do stuff like that, all clubs have members. And so what this article will do is explain who are those members. And the rule of thumb that I explained here is, in general, try to make your membership criteria broad. Because lots of people, when they're writing club constitutions, want to go in very specifically how they get members, how they elect new members, stuff like that. In general, keeping things broad is useful, just to make sure that anyone that's involved in the club, they should have the right to vote for execs and do stuff like that. So the example I use here is from the Student Association. And you see here they have these 4 membership criteria. Can anyone tell me something interesting that isn't in this membership criteria? I also heard it.
I see.
Yes, exactly. Wait, sorry, what's your name again?
Philip.
Phil, nice to meet you. Yes, exactly. So you see here, keeping a broad membership criteria is useful. So the Sikh Student Association, you don't have to be Sikh to join it. And that's true for most of the religious and cultural associations here on campus. So having broad membership criteria is generally useful. The one membership criteria that you can't really have super broad is about being U Ottawa students. So when I talk about remember the club's code, one of those things is at least 3/4 of your members must be UO students, which is something important to write. It usually doesn't really come up because most of the time non-U Ottawa people don't really want to join U Ottawa clubs, but having that written down is a useful thing. And then also the last section here is on membership fees. In general, I'm not a big fan of membership fees, but if you do have a membership fee, put it in this section, put it constitutionally so that you don't surprise anyone with it. Does anyone have any questions on these before I move on?
I don't see anything in that.
Oh, submit your membership roll. There's no official place you have to submit all your members to. It's a really useful thing to have. I'll get to it in a bit with executives. Keep a membership roll, who's in the club, who isn't, when do people's memberships expire. But as far as I'm aware, and Ainsley, correct me if I'm wrong, there's no official place you need to submit a membership roll or anything like that.
The only, as far as I'm aware, the only exception to that would be sometimes if you have to put a question, the only might have.
For the event that they have, but for general people.
I don't think you need to do that, but it's generally a good idea to keep a list of that because when we get to meetings and stuff like that, it's useful to know how many people need to come to meetings and how many members your club has.
Because And I also read in the code. It should be. Wise.
Right, exactly. And so it's a good idea to have. It's not 100% required. There's nowhere you need to like submit it to get approval. Okay, so moving on here, we have executives. So this is kind of like the big thing. And honestly, this will probably be the most important part of your constitution because this decides who does what work, who does things day to day. Because all of us here are club executives. And so executives, and this whole article, when you're writing it, you need to ask yourself three very important questions. First, how many people do you need to fulfill your club's role? So different clubs that do different things will have needs for different executives. Some people will need a vice president or an exec specifically for events. Some people might want things specifically for fundraising. Some people might need execs specifically for competitions. It depends on what your club does. Second question, how many people will realistically volunteer? Because depending on what your club does and how your outreach is, you might have 5 people interested in volunteering, you might have 500. And so when you're asking yourself those honest questions of like how many executives can this club support is a really useful thing so that you make sure that people will actually sign up and you'll have elections and things like that. And then thirdly, how defined do you want your roles to be? So the general theme that I've been saying here is keep things broad, and that's kind of applies here as well. You'll have executives with full titles, so like your president or your VP finance or something like that. Most of that is self-explanatory. Putting a couple sections in your constitution explaining in broad terms what each executive does is useful when you're talking about accountability and making sure who's doing that. I'll get to it a little bit in finance with like making sure who's officially considered a signing officer, who's officially in charge of the club and has things like that. That is a useful thing. And then this here, this is not anything official with CBO rule. This is just like a personal thing for me. Be very aware of what it's called Parkinson's law and then also exec creep. So one thing that happens with clubs over time is execs are talking and they're like, well, we need, we should have another VP events or we should have another committee. We should have a couple more execs. That's something that's happened with UMSU with mock trial. We've gone from 7 to 9 execs in 1 year. So Parkinson's law, Parkinson was a British bureaucrat for a while. The law is work expands so as to fill the time available for its completion. The more people you assign to a task, they will usually do the task in the same amount of time. And so this is why bureaucracies increase. And so in general, having more people assigned as execs can be a useful thing. We're all students, we're all busy, we all want to have more hands on deck. But also being aware of what I call exec creep, of having more and more and more executives can also be an issue as well, because you need to do things like find everyone's schedules. If you're planning an executive meeting, it's a lot easier to do it with 5 people than with like 15. And also if you're moving on to executive roles. So again, as I was saying, this varies a whole lot based on the club and what your club does. But in general, you'll need some people to like run the club. So presidents, either one president or co-presidents in various cases. It's really important to have someone to kind of keep records, so keeping membership rolls, keeping stuff like that. And you also will want someone like officially signed to keep track of money and run the bank account and stuff like that. These don't necessarily have to be different people. So one thing that's really useful for small clubs, because most clubs will have like a secretary that keeps track of records and a treasurer that keeps track of money related things. You can combine that in small clubs into one secretary treasurer. There are also some things that aren't like explicitly required, but are also really useful. So having someone to run your social media for pretty much any club of any size is something that you'll definitely want. So a vice president of communications, a vice president external or internal, or something similar to that. And then also here, it's probably a good thing to put in sections that make sure you're always in line with the club's code. So make sure that all your executives go to U Ottawa, so you can't have any Carleton students or alumni or people like that on your executive board. Make sure at least one of your executives is bilingual. And I'll get to it with elections, but you can't have your club be a dictatorship. You have to make sure there's a fair and democratic process for selecting your executives. Do you have any questions on that? Yes.
I've seen a lot of clubs that do not have democracy and they don't normally get called out by CBO. I think it's better to be on the safe side there. Can you, if you're a small club, can you not risk it?
Well, if you're a small club, you don't need to risk it. If you have less than 25 members, you don't need to follow as stringent of guidelines of having democratic elections and stuff like This goes to my views on democracy in general, but I think having more democratic elections is a good thing. But like in general, the club's code guidelines just make sure your club should be a democracy. So it doesn't necessarily mean you have to have these super complicated election procedures. Yes.
So just on that point, if I decide to start like a new club right now with some friends, would it be okay to proclaim ourselves as the executive until we have enough to do it, or should we something get done?
So when you're starting a club, so Katie and I started a club last year. When you're first starting it up, obviously you'll have a few people that volunteer to be executives. And the rule is if you have less than 25 members, like you don't need to follow as stringent guidelines when it comes to bilingualism or internal democracy. So obviously like the people who are founding a club will probably be its first execs. But once you have more than 25 members, that's when you should be scheduling a general assembly and some elections and ways to do that. In general, like most clubs, unless they're like explicitly political clubs, you won't have like super competitive elections, and most execs tend to stay on for as long as they want. But I'll get to it when I get to elections, having a process to do things like that and make sure everything's run fairly and democratically is generally a really useful thing. Any other questions or any other questions from the chat?
So you were talking about having an executive board on the like leading the club, right? In the club like organization, in the team, is there a distinction between people who are involved but who are not executives and people who are just like involved? Like, could you have like an elected executive who then like interview people, help them be on the teams? Is that something that is possible in the like CUO guidelines?
Well, firstly, thank you for bringing that up. So in general, like you can have people that help your execs. So the general requirements are that you should be internally democratic for electing your so you have an executive board, executive council, coordinated committee, whatever you call that. You can have committees below that to help your executives. And so, like obviously, if someone volunteers to help in social media, you don't have to go through a full formal election with them.
Yeah.
It's just like the people that are like legally in charge of your club, they should be chosen democratically. But it's like, from personal experience, it's really useful to have committees and stuff like that for people that want to volunteer but don't like have that much time or stuff like that. So, is there a question here?
Yeah, so talk about like 25 members. In terms of like districting, I was part of the election.
It depends a lot on like the club you on specifically what sort of club you're running. When you were first filing a club with CVUO, you have to put the names and suit numbers of 25 people that support the creation of it. Which like for us, when we were creating mock trial, those were our first 25 members. And so that also goes back to keeping a membership roll. So like keeping some internal document, like how many people have like been to your events, have come to your meetings and stuff like that. Just like people that you would consider involved with the club, having that role is pretty useful. And for the most part, like most clubs will have a membership role with more than 25 members, even if only like 10 or 15 are actually like going to meetings regularly. Hope that kind of answers your question. Sure.
Is it possible to have like tiers of membership in a certain organization? So in my particular case, I'm taking over an informally run student association that has not been recognized by the CVO and is not a recognized student government. So we put on events for students like in our program and in similar programs, but it's also like an advocacy organization, right, for the program. So it's in our interest to have execs be students of the program, right? But we don't want to limit the membership to just software engineering students. Can you have like members and then voting members in your like defining your constitution or?
Yes, and like, with membership, I suggest it being broad, but it doesn't necessarily have to. And some clubs having different tiers of membership can be useful. So you have like candidate members of people that are like wanting to join the club, but they have to like wait a couple of weeks, and then voting members, and like you have different requirements for executives than regular members. I would just caution against making it like a super structured too.
Yeah, too stratified.
But like in general, whatever is best for what your club does. So obviously, wait, sorry, what's the society you're with?
Software Engineering Students Association.
Makes sense. Yeah, so in that case, yeah, I can have like you auto students in general being able to be members, but it makes sense to have your execs be software engineers. Any more questions before I move on? Awesome. So next second here is about meetings. So this is another thing that the club's code specifically mentions, which is that in order to be considered a club and be considered active, you have to have at least one of each of these three types of meetings per semester. So first, public meeting or a public event, which is an event that you run that's open to students across campus. So for like philanthropic clubs, it'll be a fundraiser. For cultural student associations, it's like a potluck or an event or something like that. For competitive clubs, it'll be a competition or a training meeting or something like that, which is generally pretty straightforward. You have to have at least one per semester, but almost every club has more than that. Second is executive meetings, which can be pretty informal. It's just where your execs all meet and talk about how to run the club, divvy up responsibilities, and things like that. And the third one on there, general meetings, general assemblies. You'll see a couple different terms for it, which is kind of like official meeting of the club, which is generally what you use to elect your executives, to amend your constitution. Most people make big announcements during the meetings and have formal ways to question your executives, do things like that. So anything that like you want to do like officially and legally, you generally want to do during a general meeting or general assembly. And you want to make sure you're doing at least one of these every semester, not necessarily every year. Because lots of organizations will do like an annual general meeting, one per year. The club's code requires you to do one per semester, which is something that is useful and important to bear in mind. And when we get to elections in a second, might be something if you want to like stagger your elections or do things like that. And then also the important thing here is to lay out general meeting rules, but don't over-define things. So what do I mean by that? So let's say, for example, if you want to have an executive meeting every week, you think that's an important thing to have to make sure everyone's on the same page. I would highly recommend against putting you should have an executive meeting every week into your constitution. Because in general, when you're talking about constitutional rules, these kind of high level things, you should be asking yourself, what is kind of the minimum that our executives and our club should do in order to stay effective? And it goes back to what I was talking about before, is if you kind of like write overly strict rules of how to like run your club, it can lead to situations where your executives are doing things just to jump through hoops and kind of like navigate the red tape instead of being effective for your club. So in general, instead, maybe saying you should have at least one executive meeting a month or one per semester, and then still doing them every week or two. This, like the rules you put in your constitution are your minimum, not necessarily like the ideal or what you're going to actually be doing. Let's just make sure that your club stays active and does things, and that your executives have a framework. And in general, the example here I have is from the EDS, and we have execs from the EDS here as well. And just, I think in general, it was explaining the English Debating Society is obviously centered around debating. So they spend some of their constitution talking about like how those debates are structured and how things go about. And that's something that I generally like when I was looking through these constitutions. Any questions on that? So I know I had lots of questions on executive transitions, elections. This is kind of the important slide on that. So how do you choose your execs? And this is, again, one of the kind of really important things you're writing when you write your constitution. So there are two, I call them broad models, of how you choose your executives. There's the electoral model and the recruitment model, which is basically the difference between like a country and a company and things like that. So with the electoral model is where you have elections for your executives. So you announce things, you'll have a general meeting, people will nominate themselves, and then you vote on them. This is in general what the club's code recommends for choosing your executives. And when you're choosing like top executives for clubs, your president and people like that, this is the model that you should be following. I'm not going to go into detail about like specific ways to run your elections. I'm a poli-sci nerd, so you can come up to me and ask me about that afterwards. But kind of like two important things you should do to run elections fairly is make sure you have some sort of like elections rule, election rules or electoral code or something like that. It can be really straightforward. And I actually recommend it being pretty simple and straightforward unless your club is explicitly political or you'll have really competitive elections. Generally keeping things simple is useful. And then also just making sure your constitution appoints someone to run your elections and making sure that someone is pretty generally impartial. So it can kind of gold standard what the student union uses is they appoint a chief electoral officer that is outside of the student union, make sure they don't have any conflict of interest. Lots of clubs that isn't really feasible. But like making sure that whoever is running your elections committee, a chief electoral officer, something like that, making sure there's someone that all your candidates and your club members can trust. So don't have like your president running their own election, things like that. The second model I have here is called the recruitment model, which basically where executives will interview, it's like applying for a job. The executives will interview their potential replacements, and then they'll select some people and bring them up. So Phil, this is going back to your question on committees. This is something that's really useful for kind of like bringing on people that you want to bring onto exec. So if you're appointing advisory committees or people like that, having a recruitment model is really useful. Because like some people will flake if they want to like run for elections or things like that, or some people want to kind of dip their toes into the water of being an executive without fully committing all the time and effort and flex volunteers it takes to run a club. And so having this model can be really useful for choosing that. And generally, you can have a mix of both. That's what I actually recommend when you're doing club, having a mix of both elections for your top executives and recruitment for some others. But just make sure that like the rule of thumb I use is if someone's looking at your club, they call it a democracy. So make sure that you have elections for all your top people. And in general, why I have section 6 up here, this is something I'm really proud of when I wrote it. Is when you have someone that's running your elections, it's probably a pretty useful thing to have them be appointed and independent. So with with mock trial, our secretary, the person who is like in charge of all our records and who runs our election, we do that through an electoral or through a recruitment model. And we make sure that they are able to remain independent and do their job. And we think that that was better than having an election for us. The person we chose as our secretary is able to remain a little bit independent of us because us as execs, it's a little harder to figure out. Does anyone have any more questions on that before I move on? Hydration is key. Next. So this is the section on finance. Depending on what your club does, this will probably be your shortest section, unless you're explicitly a philanthropic club or you're a big club with lots of funding. But this is also probably the most important section, because if someone's going to get sued, it's because of finance. And just look to the student union 5 years ago for some reasons why it's important to have processes like this. So in your finance section, you should lay out how money is raised, who has control over it, and like who acts as the club's signing officers. And signing officers are just like the people who have control over the bank account. So you usually have 2 to 3. A general rule that most banks have is they'll have about 3 signing officers and you need to sign off of 2 of them in order to make changes. And so having people like your presidents, your vice presidents of finance, or the secretary, those are all generally good candidates. Kind of like your top executives for the club. They're the ones that should remain accountable. And in general, this is something where it's like, you should probably be following best practices. Don't try to get creative when it comes to your finance section, because being creative when it comes to finance is usually fraud. So a good example here comes from Amnesty International. Most of the philanthropic clubs have good sections on this. It lays out how finances are managed, who's accountable for it, who kind of controls money coming in and out. And generally making sure that this is all transparent is also useful as well. Anyone have any questions on finance? Yes, in the back there.
Yeah, so obviously the example you have is a philanthropic club, so they go a little bit more. But if you were the president or the co-president of a smaller club that's just getting started and you wanted to kind of look at another constitution as a guideline, is there a specific club or a specific constitution you'd suggest for that?
There's not like anything specifically I'd like to say. Like lots of clubs do this pretty well because in general, this is something where it's really useful to copy off of other clubs and copy off of best practices. And that's actually just good advice in general. If you're wanting to write a good constitution, look at the other constitutions. If you look on the CVUO clubs list, all the constitutions are public documents. You can read over them. You can steal language from the ones that you like. That's spoiler alert. That's what I did for about half of mock compile. I just used language that I liked from other constitutions. It's generally useful because they're interpreted in similar ways. There's no such thing as plagiarism when you have legal documents that are really important. Any more questions on this before I move on? Yes.
Yeah, what happened to the student?
Scandal,
Yeah, that's a story for another time.
huge embezzlement scandal.
Yeah.
Shut down the union. Yeah, there's a UOSU is new as of like 4 years ago.
There's new stories.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's why it's important to be transparent with your club finances. Then you know who's able to take the fall.
Had a like the president had like a tasting restaurants club. So they were like funding like kind of under the table union money.
Oh my God.
And yeah, it was a big.
Wait, do we have any questions from the chat before I move on?
Restaurant.
It's getting sidetracked.
There's like, yeah, there's news articles on it.
Before we get sidetracked into a discussion on student politics, let's keep moving on. So the last major point I have here is on discipline and code of conduct. So for those of you that were on the session on prevention of sexual violence, this is something that is really important to make sure you have some way to keep your executives and just members of the club accountable. So you don't have to go into like explicit detail unless you're a lawyer on like specific codes of conduct or stuff like that. But having some sort of process to make sure that you can remove executives, either if they're not doing their jobs properly or if something more malicious is going down, having some formal process to do that to make sure it is fair, but also that you're able to make sure the club is open to everyone and a safe place for everyone. That is really important. Having that written down in black and white is useful because if you write a section like this is the sort of section that you will probably never use. But if you ever get in a situation like this where you have kind of a rogue exec or an exec that is being malicious and harming the club, making sure you have rules for that is a really important thing. And my rule of thumb for this is to follow 3 E's. That if you have a discipline system, it should be equal, efficient, and equity driven. Equal, just make sure it's fair. So having some, you don't need to go into detail, but putting in terms like following the principles of fundamental justice, which is a Canadian legal term. Having things like that just to make sure that if you have a discipline system, making sure it's fair is generally really useful. Making it efficient. What I mean by this is you like the kind of burden of proof and all the sorts of things that we think about when we think of courts. You don't necessarily have to have that when it comes to clubs because most of our clubs don't really have the resources to have these full like, trials and stuff like that. But having some sort of system that is fair but also efficient is really useful. If you have things that drag out for 3 or 4 years, everyone involved is going to be graduated by then.
Someone wants to say graduate, he should be not. If they are farm execution, but you have also to continue or
In general, because you have the rule that all executives must be Ottawa students, once you graduate, you're generally not involved.
so if there is no one after me to call, we cancel that.
That's the importance of having like good elections and good recruitment processes.
Let's say if there is no small.
Yes, Ainsley, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you don't have any executives or no members, then your club will lapse on, I think it's April 31st, or like over the summer every year.
Like every semester you have to fill out a club review. And if you don't do that, then your club like is no longer considered a club for the next semester. So it's important to do. So if you don't have members, you don't fill out a club review, you don't have a club. So if it's like on purpose that you don't want to have a club in the next semester, like you can reach out to CVO to like formally, other than just like letting it lapse, but yeah, I guess that's the official process.
So what is that review? How we feel it?
The CVO will communicate with the executives closer to the date, like it's normally near the end of the semester.
Yeah, and so, sorry, last thing on here is just the example. I said four political clubs are generally good for constitutions. This section is all the young liberals have on how to remove executives. And that's what I'm talking about with the 3 E's. Is that just making sure you have some sort of system to remove executives and just making sure it's fair and efficient and equity driven can be really useful, because in situations where you have rogue execs or people that you want to remove from the club, it's usually a bit of a crisis. And so making sure that you have the rule that everyone agrees with, that everyone wants to follow, can be a really important thing. And that can be the difference between your club surviving or not. Anyone have any more questions on that before I move on? I'm right on time with this, and I'm really surprised that I am. So just last things are just some miscellaneous things. So these will usually be like the last section of your constitution. And again, as I was talking about discipline, this is the sort of stuff that you'll probably never use, but it's really important to have and review. So the first thing is on interpretation and parliamentary authority. So this is basically saying who has the final say if you need to interpret what your constitution says. Because no matter, like, unless you're writing, unless your constitution is like 100,000 words long, you're going to have situations where language is ambiguous. That's the whole reason why lawyers exist. And so making sure you have a way to just interpret it, that's important. Also, the important thing here is one of the big clubs code rules is your constitution has to be bilingual. So putting in a clause to say, like, how we interpret things, if the French and English translations say different things, that can be really useful when you're trying to interpret things. So the standard that I've seen with lots of constitutions is that you should defer to the language that the constitution was originally written. So with mock trial, it was originally written in English, because I'm an Anglophone. And so from that, if you're interpreting things, you should be put more deference to the English interpretation. And also the second thing here is that big quote that I'm not going to say word for word. I'd recommend, if there's anything you want to put word for word into your constitution, it's probably that language. So Robert's Rules of Order is something that I have not read, and most people don't need to read, but it is something that is, it's like about 1,000 pages of just like how to run an organization. And so by putting in a clause like this, like saying that like, if there's any difference in interpretation, just defer to Robert's Rules. That's something that can, again, come in handy because you'll have a reference book on if there's a question like how do we run this election, or are members like allowed to vote on this or not? How do we file a motion, stuff like that. Something like this will probably have something like this will have an answer for you. So putting it into your constitution saying, when in doubt, check Robert's Rules or check some other sort of like official parliamentary authority, it can be a useful thing to have. And then the last section there is on amendments. This is one thing where I generally like to follow the rule to keep it simple. So the standard for when you want to amend a constitution is to have 2/3 of members at a like general meeting or general assembly vote in favor of that amendment. That's what I'd probably recommend to put in almost verbatim. Different clubs will have different ways to amend their constitution, but having something that is simple, with its 2/3 vote here, allows for you to change your constitution a decent amount of times. So because you're having a general meeting at least once a semester, have ways to change it and tweak it, and make those changes, while also making it the sort of thing you need some sort of consensus on the club before you make changes. Because if you're changing the constitution like fundamentally every semester, that can also be an issue as well. Anyone have any questions on this? Yes.
About something, but
You're in luck because that's the last slide. Yeah, what's the
country constitutions and club constitutions are like different in their own way, but they're also similar. Like what this branch of government does and what this executive does. And something country constitutions have that club constitutions don't is something like term limits. So like, what kind of that have on a club and would you like recommend?
So I'll talk about term limits specifically, and then I'll talk about generally the difference between countries and organizations. With term limits, the good thing about university clubs is we naturally already have term limits of about 4 years when you're a student. And in general, like term limits are like useful, like and like dictators and stuff like that. But having the election section of your constitution, generally you'll have elections every year. And so like an executive term will usually be no longer than 1 year. And so by making sure that you have having a relatively short term like that, by having a chance for people to re-elect things, and also by having the sort of natural term limit of 4 or 5 years that you stay in Ottawa, that's something I recommend. If like, there's nothing specifically wrong about having term limits, but I generally prefer flexibility in constitutions, as you can probably tell. And so by having those kind of long things, because in general, you also want institutional knowledge. So if you have executives stick around for 3 or 4 years, that can be useful in making sure that you don't have like your entire executive board all graduate at once and then people have to start from scratch. So that's my point on that. And then also in the difference between country constitutions and club constitutions. The big things is one, because constitutions for countries are a lot higher stakes. If a club is run badly, you know, it just has bad events for its members. If a country is run badly, people die. And so by making, like you can have all of those like, you know, separation of powers, you can have a judicial system and stuff like that. But it's generally with like clubs and organizations, efficiency is something that's also a lot more important. And because it's voluntary, all the people involved in your club be a part of it. So efficiency is something that's a lot more, unless you want to write a constitution like 40 or 50,000 words long.
Instead of like saying something like the copy of the text of the Constitution in the language like originally, I know in our Constitution we have something like that if there's like a disagreement or something, that it's just the executive that final decision. Also,
That's what I recommend. That's what mock trial uses, that if there is an like interpretation thing, that the executives are the one that interpret it. Because like if you don't have like an interpretation committee or something like that to do it, having your executives generally makes sense. And also with that, I'd like to like, that's the one section where I like to use catch-all clauses. So I forget the exact wording for UMSU, but ours is basically that the executives are the one that interpret the Constitution, but they must be guided by like precedent and the principle of good faith. Because honestly, if you're at the point where you're doing like these really weird kind of fringe interpretations to get what you want as an executive, it would just be easier just to pass an amendment to the Constitution. In general, interpretation is that sort of thing that will almost certainly not come up unless it's like a really a big club that has high stakes and has things like that. But just like putting some wording in there to say who interprets the Constitution and what are some of the basic rules on that is generally a useful thing. So that's the end of like the formal presentation. If anyone has any questions or if anyone has any like suggestions for the group, now is your time to do so. And also if there's anyone in the chat watching, thank you for watching this. You can also leave some answers in the chat or also feel free to unmute maybe. So it's better to put questions in the chat for people on Zoom. Anyone have any final questions, comments, concerns, anything like that? Awesome. So I'm about 10 minutes under time, which is perfect. So thank you guys all for coming. This was very fun. If anyone has any other questions or just wants to talk to me, feel free to talk to me after this. Or if you want to get in touch with me, join the mock trial server and then you can DM me from there. I'm always need to plug my phone. Thank you guys for coming. You have about 10, 15 minutes and then there's closing ceremonies, right?
I think so. I was just checking with someone.
Okay.
Yeah, I would just hang around. There's still food left, so feel free. Still coffee left. But yeah, just linger around, and then I believe the closing will kind of be in the same room.
Thank you guys so much. Stop the recording now.
Be your additional information.